Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah. So we'll go to the next sampling technique, that is cluster sampling. So cluster sampling is a probability sampling technique which is used for very large populations. So you want to study the whole population of a country, which is a very large population, and you want to take a sample out of that country's population, then you will use cluster sampling. So what do you do in cluster sampling? You will divide the population into different clusters or different groups. So these groups should not be overlapping. They should not be overlapping over each other, and the population should be divided into different groups. So that is how you do the cluster sampling technique. And then from each cluster, you will randomly select some units to be included into your sample. So this is how you use the cluster sampling technique. So suppose you want to find out the number of defective machine parts. Suppose there is an inventory. So like 400 cases of products are there. 400 cases of products are there, and in each case 50 products are there, and you want to find out what is the defective parts in those in that 400 cases. So there are 20,000 machine parts in those 400 cases. So then you apply the cluster sampling technique, and each case you will take it as a cluster. So each case of 50 each, you will take it as a cluster, and from each cluster you will randomly take out some machine parts to be included into your sample. So this is how the cluster sampling technique can be used to take a sample from very large populations which are spread out, which are very large. Then you use the cluster sampling technique. So cluster sampling technique is also a technique which is reliable, which is not very costly, and you want to cover geographical areas. Like I told you, entire country's population you want to cover, as you want to take a sample, then you will call that as area sampling technique. You will not call it as cluster sampling technique, you will call it as area sampling technique. You will divide the geographical areas into different sections. Like you will take north one area, south one area, west one area, and east one area. So all these areas is your cluster, and from each cluster you will randomly select some elements to form your sample. So this kind of cluster sampling technique can also be used in social sciences. When you want to do study, find out public opinion on a certain situation, on a certain event, you want to find out public opinion. So then you can use this cluster sampling technique to take your sample from the population and then do study on the population, and you can find out what is the opinion of the public, what is the majority opinion of the public. From the result of studying that sample, you will apply that result to the rest of the population. So suppose you want to find out public opinion against the ruling party. So you will divide that population into different clusters, and then randomly from each cluster you will take out some elements to form your sample, and then you will do study of each sample. You will give questionnaire to the people in each sample. You will collect the opinion, and then you will do analysis of the data. using some statistical tool, you will do analysis of this data, and you will come out with your results that 70% of the people are in favor of the ruling party and 30% are not in favor of the ruling party. This is the result you got from the sample. Now this result you will apply it to the population and say that 70% of the population are favoring the ruling party and 30% are not favoring. Like this, you will do your research study. So cluster sampling technique can be used in social sciences research when you want to do ecological studies, you want to study the environmental damage or what changes are happening in environment, you want to do research studies, then you will do cluster sampling to get your sample. Demographic studies, you want to do what is the change in the population, how many age group of people are working now, more younger and younger age group of people are working now. So you want to do a demographic research study on that. So you will take your sample using this technique. So this is all about the cluster sampling technique. So what is the advantage of this cluster sampling technique? It is very convenient to take sample from very large populations by using this sampling technique. So easy way, convenient way to take sample from large populations. You don't need a list of the population. You don't need information about the population. You can just apply this cluster sampling technique and take out the uh, uh, sample from the population. So here in the random sampling technique, like it is used for geographical study, so you can divide the geographical population into different levels or different areas by using a single stage or multi-stage sampling technique. So in the next slide, you will understand what is single stage and what is multi-stage sampling technique. So this is a convenient sampling technique to do field work, does not require much time. Cost wise also it is not much when compared to other probability sampling techniques. It is flexible. Sometimes you can use single stage in this sampling technique. Sometimes you can use multi-stage in this sampling technique. Disadvantage is that when you are dividing the population into clusters, sometimes you may not divide it into proper clusters. You may show bias. You may show partiality in dividing the population into different clusters. So that is one disadvantage of using this cluster sampling technique. So suppose a researcher wants to study adults in households in a particular street. So he wants to interview the adults in the households in a particular street. Now the number of adults in each household will be different. Some houses only 2 people will be there, adults. In some houses more than 2 people will be there. Large families will be there. So then bias can happen. You cannot divide the population into clusters because of the variation in the population. Too much variation in the population, it may lead to sampling error, sampling mistake, and you will not get a sample which is more efficient or which is statistically more accurate compared to other probability sampling techniques. So this is the disadvantage of this cluster sampling technique. So what is multi-stage sampling technique? Now single stage sampling technique is what we discussed just now, cluster sampling technique. So you divide population into different clusters like north, south, east, west. You divide the population. That is single stage cluster sampling technique. So what is multi-stage sampling technique? So multi-stage sampling technique, suppose you want to do research to find out the efficiency of nationalized banks. in India. So you want to take a sample of few banks. So what do you do? First stage, you will divide the country as per the states. So you will take Uttar Pradesh, you will take Karnataka, you will take Gujarat this side, that side you may take Orissa, like that's your first stage. So second stage, within each state, you will select some districts. So within Karnataka, you will select some districts. Within Uttar Pradesh, you will select some districts. Within Gujarat, you will select some districts, like that. That is the second stage. So then from each district, you will randomly select some banks and study the efficiency of these banks. So this is called as two-stage sampling technique. Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because power is going, coming, going, coming. So that's what I was wondering whether you can hear me. Okay, so that is two-stage sampling in cluster sampling. So now you further want to divide, like within the state, you are selecting some districts. Then within the district, you want to select some towns. So within the towns, you will select some banks to be included into your sample. Then it will be called as three-stage sampling technique. So this is called as multi-stage sampling technique in cluster sampling for those populations which is spread out, which is scattered over a large area, and you don't have a list of the population. So you want to study the efficiency of nationalized banks in India. So India is a large area. So you will take few states in India. Then within the states, you will randomly select few districts. Then within those districts, you will randomly select few towns. Then within those towns, you will randomly select some national banks and see how they are working, whether they are efficient or not. So this is called as multi-stage cluster sampling technique. So it is very good for those populations which are very large, which are geographically spread out, which are scattered over a large area, and when you don't have knowledge or complete list of that population, then you can use the cluster multi-stage cluster sampling technique. So what is the advantage of this cluster sampling technique? It is convenient, it is flexible, it is an efficient way of taking a sample from large spread out populations. And you can do field research by taking sample with the help of this multi-stage cluster sampling technique. So you can take out your sample quickly, saving time, effort, and money. These are the advantages of cluster sampling technique. What are the disadvantages? Disadvantage is when you are dividing the population into different clusters, you may make classification mistakes. So that is a sampling error. And sometimes when you are covering large populations, the cost may go up. You are dividing a very large population into different clusters, then the cost of your research may go up. So that is the disadvantage of multi-stage cluster sampling technique. Now the next technique is sequential sampling. Sequential sampling technique is to take a sample from a population where you are not very sure what should be the size of your sample in proportionate to the population. So suppose you want to do research with a single sample, then you will call it as single sampling, sequential sampling technique. Suppose if it's a very large population and you have to take two samples, then it will be known as double sequential sampling. So this sequential sampling technique is very useful to also to take a sample from very large populations. 1 minute. Hello? Yes? Okay, already it's done. Already admission is done. Okay. Now we will see what is the strength and weakness of this probability sampling techniques. We have seen all the probability sampling techniques, that is simple random sampling technique, systematic sampling technique, stratified sampling technique, cluster sampling technique. We have seen all of them. So now we will see what is their strength and weakness, or what is their advantages and disadvantages. So simple random sampling technique is easy to understand. The results are very easy to show, but it is an expensive way of taking the sample from the population, and you are not very sure whether it's a precise sample, whether it is an accurate sample. You are not very sure whether the sample is representative of the population, whether the sample is having the same characteristics of the population, that you are not very sure. That is the weakness of simple random sampling technique. Then systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is in a very systematic way. You are taking a sample from the population, so you will get, you're covering the population evenly, and you will get a more representative sample from the population. It is easier to implement. And the weakness is sometimes when you are taking the sample from the populations, sometimes you may not consider all the characteristics of the population. It can be a sampling error. It can be a sampling error. Some characteristics of the population you may not include into your sample. That can be a weakness of systematic sampling technique. Then what is stratified sampling technique? You can divide precisely your population into subgroups or subpopulations, which is known as strata. So that is its strength. So you get a more precise sample, you get a more accurate sample. What is the weakness? When you are stratifying the population on various characteristics like demographic variables, you can take, like on the basis of age, on the basis of gender, on the basis of income, on the basis of occupation. These are the demographic variables. When you are dividing the population on the basis of these variables, sometimes you may do the division stratification wrongly. Sampling error can happen, and the cost of your research can go up. So it becomes expensive. Cluster sampling. Cluster sampling, the strength of this sampling technique, it's easy to implement. Cost-wise, also it is effective. Weakness is sometimes you may not get a precise sample. Your sample may be imprecise. It may not be accurate sample. So you will not get accurate results from doing a study on such kind of sample. So that is the weakness of cluster sampling. So these are the strengths and weaknesses of non-probability sampling techniques, which I think you should see later. First, we will see each one of these non-probability sampling techniques. What is non-probability sampling technique? When each element of the population does not get an equal chance to be selected into the sample, it is known as non-probability sampling technique. So what are the different techniques in non-probability? You have convenience sampling, you have judgmental sampling, you have quota sampling, and you have snowball sampling. So when is non-probability sampling techniques used? Non-probability sampling techniques are used when the researcher has very less time, when he has very low budget in doing the research, and when the random sampling technique, he feels if he uses that, error can happen, mistake can happen, and when he does not have complete list of the population, so then he will use non-probability sampling technique. So these are the reasons when the researcher will go for non-probability sampling technique. So non-probability sampling technique is an arbitrary sampling technique where the researcher will decide how the sample has to be taken from the population. So you cannot do statistical test on such kind of a sample, because the sample is not uh, taken on the basis of the any technique or any statistical way. It has not been done in a very precise way. It has not been done. Mainly, the researcher will decide. He will use his judgment which element he will take from his sample to include in his population. So depending on the researcher's convenience, depending on the researcher's judgment, non-probability sampling is done. So what are the names of non-probability sampling techniques? You have deliberate sampling, judgmental sampling, and purposeful sampling techniques. So non-probability sampling technique, when each item of the population has no chance of being included into the sample. The items of the population are selected deliberately by the researcher to form the sample. The researcher will decide which population elements will I take as my sample. It is all the researcher's judgment and the researcher's convenience. So, example of non-probability sampling technique. Suppose you want to study economic conditions of people living in a state. So, that is your research. So, in a state, there will be so many towns, there will be so many villages. Now, which are the towns and which are the villages you will take to form your sample, that will be decided by the researcher. The researcher will use his judgment. He will select some towns, some villages which is close to him. So convenience. As per his convenience, he will select some towns and some villages which is close to him. So that is known as non-probability sampling technique, where he has taken a sample from the population as per his judgment, as per his convenience. He has taken the sample. So such a sampling technique will be known as non-probability sampling technique. And such a sample will not be a very accurate sample. You cannot do any kind of statistical analysis by on such kind of a sample. So the non-probability sampling techniques, where are the different types? When is it used? Non-probability sampling techniques are mainly used when you are doing exploratory research. You are exploring something about an event or about a situation. You are exploring, like COVID, regarding COVID. It's an exploratory research you are doing. You are trying to find out more about the virus. So then when you are doing such kind of an exploratory research, then you will use non-probability sampling techniques to take your sample from the population. So first one is convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is the least reliable sampling technique. It's not at all reliable, but it is the cheapest and easiest sampling technique to use. The researcher is taking the sample as per his convenience. Suppose you want to find out the opinion of people regarding a public issue. You want to find out. So you want to find out what is their opinion regarding some issue. So you will collect as per your convenience. You will collect your family members, your neighbors, those who are staying close to you. You will select those people to form your sample. That is convenience non-probability sampling technique, where the researcher has selected those people who are close to him, from whom he can collect the data easily. So he will collect those people. Such a sample will be called as convenience non-probability sampling technique. So it's not a reliable sample. You have not covered all the people, you have only covered some people which are close to you. So it's not a reliable sample, but it is the cheapest and simplest sampling non-probability sampling technique. And you don't require a list of the population. You cannot do any statistical analysis on that sample. You will do only qualitative analysis on that sample. You will collect the data and then qualitative analysis you will do. That is, again, the researcher will study the data, and what he understands about the data, that only will be his result. What he understood, what is his interpretation of that data which he has collected from that sample, that only he will publish as his result. So it's a qualitative research. So such kind of qualitative research, you will select the sample by means of non-probability sampling technique. So what is the disadvantage of convenience sampling technique? It's highly biased because it depends on the researcher's convenience, what the researcher wants, whom he wants to include into his sample. It is all left to the researcher. So he will not get a representative sample. That means he will not get a sample which has the same characteristics as that of the population. So he will not get a representative sample. The sample will be least reliable sample, and whatever findings he has got from studying that sample, the findings cannot be generalized to the rest of the population. It cannot be applied to the rest of the population, whatever results he got. So that is the kind of qualitative research which can be done by using this non-probability sampling technique, where you use convenience sampling. As per the researcher's convenience, you will select the sample from the population to be included into your sample. So purposeful sampling, I think we will stop here for today. And tomorrow I will take HR. I am just finishing third module, last topic. So I will take it tomorrow. Okay. And I will Sorry, I didn't know I was muted. Okay, I'm taking attendance. Afreen, Aparna, Bharat,
Present, ma'am.
Danusha. Bharat
Yes,
is
ma'am.
there?
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay, Danusha.
Ma'am, Afreen
Afreen is
present,
there?
ma'am.
Okay, okay. Afreen is
Yes,
there.
ma'am.
Okay. Dilip, Dinesh, Firdos, Gayatri, Hemant, Jayashri, Lakshman, Manohar, Nalina.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Nalina is there. Nivedita, Pavan.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Praveen, Rakshita, Ranjita, Sampath, Shashank, Shashikala,
Yes, ma'am.
Saundarya, Saundarya M,
Yes, ma'am.
Saundarya S, Sunil Tepeswamy, Vikas. What? Okay, yeah, I marked you.
Nivedita,
Vikas, you are there? Okay.
Ma'am,
Yashri,
Nivedita.
I marked you. Yashri, I marked you. Okay, Pavan, did you meet placement officer? Shashikala, Pavan.
Yes, ma'am. We met yesterday.
Okay, what did he tell?
He took our number and email ID and he told that he will give us information.
Okay, so I'll do one thing. I'll share his number with you. You just call him also. Just remind him because he, in other works, no, he may forget.
Yeah, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
So I'll share the number with you, and you just remind him. Give a call to him or message him. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.